Ellen Duncan was her name. We called her Mrs. Duncan. She was my junior English teacher at Tahlequah High School. The fall of 1968, she had just turned 65 years old. That was the year I had her. She had no children of her own, but over the years, she educated and influenced hundreds of young people. She was a prim and proper lady. When she discovered I planned to become a minister, she mentioned a couple of Ivy League schools she hoped I could attend. Her view of ministry training was different than mine. She encouraged the boys to invite a girl to go to the prom. On the other hand, she opposed a banquet because too many students wouldn't know how to act at a formal dinner. In one essay I wrote, I mentioned that a food was hot. She asked me if I was referring to spice or temperature. That was a lesson in using the right word, a lesson that I haven't forgotten. I also remember her often saying, "The first shall be last, and the last shall be first." I knew the quote was from Scripture. At the time, I may not have known what it meant, and I don't recall how she used the quote. But that was a statement made by Jesus, and it's in our text this morning. Our text is Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. They left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were, because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." But they did not understand what he meant, and were afraid to ask about it. They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" They kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "If anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and the servant of all." He took a little child and had him stand among them. Taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me." Our text is in two basic parts, and they're very closely related. The first has to do with Jesus' second prediction of his upcoming death and resurrection. The second part has to do with a quarrel among the 12 as to who was the greatest. Jesus passed through Galilee, but didn't want anyone to know he was in the vicinity. Why is that? His public ministry was coming to an end. His focus now is on teaching the 12, not on ministering to the crowds. There is something he needed to get across to the disciples, and he didn't want any distractions. Specifically, he was teaching them that he would be killed, then rise from the dead. There are 3 occasions in Mark where Jesus tells the disciples about his upcoming suffering, about his death and resurrection. In our text this morning, the concept of betrayal is added. Already in chapter 8, verse 31, Jesus has spoken of his death. That was right after Peter's confession that he was the Christ. And we, of course, know that they have not grasped, that the 12 have not grasped what Jesus was saying. Verse 32 verifies that they did not. Jesus will again predict his death in chapter 10, verses 32 through 34, just before they arrive in Jerusalem. This is a very hard truth for the 12 to accept. And think about being in their shoes. Here is their teacher. Now, they have already decided that he is the Messiah they're expecting. Peter proclaimed that. They are thinking in political terms, like most of the folks around them, that Jesus is going to lead the nation in victory against the Roman Empire. So Jesus talking about being put to death does not really fit in with the way things ought to be. And talking about being raised from the dead doesn't really seem to help the fact that he said that he's going to be put to death. They are not comprehending. And if we were in their place at this time, we would have had trouble too, I believe. In the other account of this conversation, Matthew chapter 17, verse 23, it says the disciples were filled with grief. As they heard Jesus talking about being put to death, they were filled with grief. Well, we might ask the question, why didn't they understand the saying? And then why were they afraid to ask him about it? Mark says they were afraid to ask. Notice Luke's account, chapter 9, verse 45. But they did not understand what this meant. It was hidden from them, so that they did not grasp it, and they were afraid to ask him about it. We remember when Jesus first predicted his death and his suffering, that Peter rebuked him, said, don't talk like that. And Jesus, in response, had rebuked Peter. Perhaps they don't want to be rebuked again. And perhaps they're just in a state of denial. What do you mean you're going to be put to death? That doesn't fit in with the way things are supposed to work. But at any rate, they didn't understand what he was saying, but they didn't want to question him about it. Well, they arrive in Capernaum. Jesus asked the 12 an embarrassing question. What were you talking about on the way? Now, as they traveled by foot, they perhaps were more or less in single file, or at least in small groups. Jesus was somewhat separated from the others. He knew that they had been talking. In fact, I believe he knew what they were talking about. But he says, what were you talking about? As we went along the way. The disciples did not answer because they knew that what they were talking about was a petty argument. It was made even more petty and remarkable by the fact that Jesus had just foretold his own death and resurrection. And here they were arguing among themselves about who is going to be the greatest, which of them is the greatest. And we recall from other texts that this was a subject among the 12. They were expecting Jesus to establish a kingdom, and they were debating who was going to be at the number 2 position and number 3 position beside him. Which one's going to be the greatest? Well, Jesus, as I've said, already knew the topic of their conversation. But he sat down with them when they got into the house. And they told him something I'm sure they didn't understand. He said, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. That thought probably seemed incomprehensible to them, because the idea was the very opposite of the world's view of greatness. That is much the view that we still have even in our day. Who is the greatest? Who is first? We look to those in power. Jesus has a different definition of greatness. He says, if you're going to be first, you must be last of all. What does that mean? He defines it. You must be servant of all. Jesus, on another occasion, said the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. That is not the world's concept of greatness, is it? We are too often like little children. When it's dessert time especially. On other occasions, it's me first, me first, me first. And in a sense, most people in the world never outgrow the idea of me first. We push to the front of the line. We very seldom push to the end of the line. But Jesus teaches something different. He teaches true humility. He is the example of true humility. The world's view of greatness and how it is obtained has to do with power, wealth, getting an advantage over others. Jesus says just the opposite. Martel Pace said, to be told that servitude is the key to greatness was a difficult lesson for them. It is still a difficult lesson. The order of life for the disciples in their relationship to each other is to be the service of love. By transforming the question of greatness into task orientation of service, Jesus established a new pattern for human relationships, which leaves no occasion for strife or opposition to one another. when we are willing to be last of all and not seeking to be first, we will get along with each other because our aim is to serve one another. Well, Jesus realizes they don't fully grasp what he's saying. And so he gives them a graphic illustration. It's a child. And he puts that child in the middle of them and holds him in his arms. William Lane says the disciples are to identify themselves with children and become the little ones who have no basis for pretensions to greatness. Now, what is the object lesson of having the child there in their midst? Well, Jesus is not saying that we become like children in all aspects, because after all, it's the little children who say, me first, me first. But a child in ancient society had no status at all. They were at the whims of their parents, especially the father. A child could be sold into slavery, a child could be put to death with very little recourse against the parents. This child has nothing to offer. But Jesus says receiving a little child in his name is the same as receiving him, and whoever receives Jesus receives God. What was Jesus saying to the disciples about true greatness? What did the child illustration really mean? Notice some related text. James chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. We are not to show partiality between the rich and the poor. James pictures what must have happened on some occasion. It says if you're worshiping together and someone who is rich comes in, don't give him the good seat. While if someone poor comes in, you say, well, sit down here by my feet. Said, after all, isn't it the rich who cause you the problems? And often it was. Basically, James is saying we don't show partiality depending upon whether one has the power and the wealth. We are impartial. Jesus himself, in Matthew chapter 25, as he describes the judgment scene of the sheep and the goats, there's a difference in the sheep and the goats. What's that difference? It is how people responded to those in need, to those who were at the bottom, who had no claim to wealth because they were poor, who had no claim to power. Jesus says, if you did it to these, you did it to me. If you didn't do it to these, you didn't do it to me. We really need to ask ourselves, what keeps us from ministering to others in need? Sometimes it is our own lack of humility, seeing ourselves as greater and more important than we are. Jesus gives us the example we are always to follow. He was self-emptying, self-sacrificing in nature. The Son of God, God become man, was on this earth. He was not rich. He was not powerful. He did not come to be served, but he came to serve. He served to the extent of giving his own life on the cross. He gives us the great example. Who is the greatest? That's really no question. Jesus is the greatest. And he became the greatest, not in the way the world would say, by being powerful, by being wealthy, by being first. He became last. He served others, even to the point of death. Earl Macmillan says, in the kingdom of God, there is no greatness in the sense of exalted leadership. Greatness rather comes in the idea of complete service. One knows Christ and even God the Father through what he learns in serving his fellow man. As I've mentioned, we often hear, me first, me first. We don't always outgrow that. That's a childlike thing, but adults are guilty of it as well. We seldom hear "me last." But those who follow Jesus will think, say, and practice "me last."